so much of how we approach data in our society forces many people to revisit their trauma and become traumatized again. And we wonder why they might struggle to reach what we might call success. Well, what is success for one thing, but when you're dealing with certain things that you've got to overcome to get there and you're really starting from ground zero, it's challenging. I think what we want to talk about today is the origin of the Delta Project as it relates to this podcast. The thesis for the podcast is What I Know Now.
Right.
And that potentially is the title for this podcast.
Right.
But to me, that is the theme.
Right. And I feel like the reason, I mean, if we go back to it, the reason why we wanted to title that is really centered around recognizing that we have a lot of people in our community who have that lived experience, especially as it relates to serving young people that are involved in the juvenile justice system and wanting to be able to connect that. Does that sound like what we?
That's exactly what we want, but it's more expansive than that as well. Right. So I think that's kind of the main focus. Okay. I mean, that's the nut graph. Yeah. That's totally what we're after. Yeah. But there's so many more people involved in that ecosystem.
I agree.
So all the people that support the people who are impacted by the system are part of the story as well. Yeah. Yeah. And they've had their own evolutions and their own journeys to understanding by supporting people in that space. So their stories are important too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to mention just other people that have maybe dealt with trauma or had experiences that shaped their becoming. Yeah. And we know we've got a lot of guys and gals, and teenagers trying to figure this stuff out. Yeah. And if this can help them see what they could become, I think that's the idea.
Well, I mean, it takes us back to the North Star question. How do I become something I don't see? Yep. Right. And then recognizing that in order for us to become something we don't see, I mean, we actually have to do it and be, as you like to describe, become. Right. And so I think it makes sense for us to just talk a little bit about like how we started, because I think where we started from and where we are now is a complete evolution. When I think back, Joel, when I first contacted you and said, hey, I've got this idea. And so I think it just makes sense maybe to give the audience a little bit of like where we come from. And so
I agree.
But I don't know exactly where to start because it's such a deep.
Well, the other thing I want to say, we're also at a moment in time. And I mean, 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about this period too.
That's true.
Which is really kind of a cool thing.
That's true.
But the origin story is important.
That's true too.
And I think it started when we started interacting with each other.
Yeah, yeah.
And really keeping an eye on this person. I mean, you saw me. Yeah. I saw you. Yeah. I'm like, okay, there's something going on with this guy that I want to figure out.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think you felt the same way.
Yeah, yeah. Because part of what I was really curious about is like, here I am working in this detention center, serving all these young people that are coming in and out within the community. And now I'm sitting on this board where we're talking about media, and I'm trying to figure out how to connect kids with lived experience involved in our JJ system, helping them tell their story. But then here I am, in this media space and unfamiliar with that space overall. I didn't know what I was doing when I was in that space, right? But sort of figuring out how to bridge it together. And then I sort of saw you in the space, and I just watched how you navigated the room. I watched how you interacted with the people in the space. And I thought, well, I wonder if he could really help me answer this question around how do you become something you don't see, especially when it relates to living in a community where young men are coming in and out of the detention center, but they're also saying, hey, I don't see the kind of guys that you're talking about, right? So I was really curious about how you might be able to help me like answer that question. And so I think it was really dope us just sort of sitting down and brainstorming and me coming up with, let's do a tabletop book. And you're like,
well, I wasn't even so sure of myself.
I did not know that
period. That was a very, stressful time to be president of that board.
Yeah.
And manage all the things I was trying to manage and create a vision for that particular organization. And I was trying to be as visionary as I could be.
Okay.
and mission driven,
Okay.
but also apply what I was learning at the time with design thinking and the degree and just the experience I had gathered and trying to synthesize that organization. And that was challenging. And I didn't, I don't think everyone
Yeah.
saw me the way you saw me.
Well, now that you say that, because I don't think I realized that, that makes me also wonder. I was also struggling with imposter syndrome because I'm like in this space and I'm trying to navigate it. I'm unfamiliar with the language. I'm unfamiliar with people in the space. But I've been told, hey, you can be a part of helping, diverse this media space. And so I came in with this lens of, oh, I'm the diversity.
Yeah. And you weren't necessarily wrong about
right,
that.
right, right.
And that's one of the challenges of those situations.
Yeah, yeah,
Because it is perception as well as actual, equity and inclusion.
yeah,
Those terms have changed. The meaning of those terms have changed
yeah.
since back in 2015 or 16 when we first started interacting. That's a whole nother podcast potentially.
Yeah, but I think it serves as something I think for us to think about too, right? Because here you are in this space. I'm seeing you and I'm wondering how can I, and I don't want to say use, but how do I connect what I see you doing into the work that I am trying to rediscover and understand myself? So I think it just all made sense now that I'm hearing the other side of the coin of that story.
I feel like there was a certain level of serendipity going on because I think we were both searching for something at that time.
Yeah.
You were looking for an answer to that question, at its basis. It's much broader than that. You were looking for a way to more deeply connect with these guys. Yeah. And I was just at a point in my life and career where I'm like, okay, I've got my antenna up, really paying attention to what's going on around me.
Yeah.
So that I can get involved in something that is important to me, that drives me, that makes impact. It can help the community grow and improve and become a better space.
Yeah. So how do you become something you don't see?
It goes back to that question, and it's, I think that's core to everyone. But when a young man in the juvenile detention center asks that question, in the situation that he asked it, that's beyond a mic drop.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's what do I say? It's like a generation drop.
Yeah, I agree. So here we are, two guys trying to figure it out, partnering up together to answer a question that we both were, I think, trying to discover ourselves. Now that I think about it, here I am trying to find an answer to a question that a young man has asked me, while at the same time trying to figure out how to solve it and answer that question for myself, but not realizing that I was actually searching for the answer to that question too.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just hearing what you just described, I was like, oh, we were both on the search to figuring out how do we become, and then we land in the space of, well, let's help these kids sort of tell their story. And I really feel like I think that was the point where I was like, oh, okay, this is where it's at. We have to find a way for other people to hear and connect to these young men. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the moment, when there are a couple moments in here, and I heard someone say something really cool about a month ago. Moments add up to momentum. And it's
a nice drop.
Maybe, I can't claim it. I heard it and I'm using that because it's really true. And so that moment when that question was asked and that moment when you told me, let's make a tabletop book, I'm like, no, we're onto something. We're onto a movement here. Yeah. We want momentum. We want these moments to create momentum, which creates a movement. And we were lucky at that time to have the connections and the resources to pull something together really in 2019 that created the foundation for our work. Yeah. But I mean, what was it like in Early Bird? We got to call out the coffee shop.
Oh yeah, always. I mean,
Early Bird Coffee Shop.
That's the home of Delta.
It is.
Yeah.
And Joel and Sarah, Sarah's always such a huge supporter of our work.
Yeah.
And I feel really at home there, and I feel really creative there. I feel like there's a strong community, and I think everyone needs to feel that in their lives.
Yeah.
To know that, no man is an island, no person is an island. We're all in this together, and I feel that when I'm at Early Bird.
Yeah. Well, I think Early Bird had to grow on me because it wasn't a place that I had gone to, but a lot of places in Grand Rapids were places I didn't go to. But I think that's also reflective of the kind of kiddos and families that I also serve, where there are businesses and organizations within the sector of their community, and there's just no connection there. So I think for me, your introduction to Early Bird is what brought me into that space. But I think that's part of why the work we do is so important, because it really requires having someone who can be an ambassador, someone who can walk alongside you and support you into that space. I honestly would have never gone into Early Bird had you not said, hey, this is where we're going to meet at, because I didn't know anything about the space. But once I got in there and started to see that it was a collective of cultures in the space. So it really shifted me, because storefront, in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is not a place I probably would belong as a brown person. And so I think that's another thing that at some point in our podcast we'll have to explore, is how do organizations and agencies and businesses connect with people when we just are looking past the window. But I think once we entered into that space, and I felt safe because you invited me in that space, and I was able to see, I'm like, oh, okay, this is okay space to not only break bread, but also to really do business. And so, yeah, Early Bird, shout out to connecting us and building the table for the Delta Project.
Yeah, and I think the other organization we need to give a shout out to is Gorilla.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Eric Johnson.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, exactly. So from Early Bird, my previous work with Eric Johnson, creating storytelling, brand storytelling together, he was able to join the conversation, and that's how we began the Delta Project conversations. Yeah. We didn't really call it that then.
No, I don't even remember what we called it.
We didn't. I don't think
we had a name for it.
We didn't. It was just the Delta Project.
Yeah.
It was emblematic of what we were. That was what we were.
Yeah.
And to me, that was phase one. And that was 2019.
Yeah.
That's the year that we incorporated. Yeah. Later in that year. That's the year that we did 5 different episodes by going into the juvenile detention center and showing up.
Yeah. I've never asked you this, but what was it like going into the juvenile detention center as a person who hasn't had anyone there, no reference to it, and then sort of walking into this space and seeing kids? What was that? Do you remember what that might have been was like for you?
I mean, it was just invigorating for me.
Okay.
I didn't feel nervous or scared or anything like that. I'm just like,
okay.
I was thinking anthropologically and culturally.
Okay.
I'm stepping into a space where I can learn something. Okay. I can be around people that, I may not always be able to be around.
Yeah.
And I have an opportunity to interact with them and hear their stories. So I thought it was great.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I tend to be a little adventurous.
Yeah.
I like to try things and see, look under the hood when it comes to understanding how people operate, really see what their motivations are and what's driving them, so that, they might be able to be inspired and better, that we can inspire people and bring out the best, their potential, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember the first time, I think the staff were more surprised than anything, because I don't know if I did a really good job of explaining them, like, hey, Gorilla's coming in, it's a film production company. They're going to bring some volunteers and they're bringing equipment. And I think the visitation door, I remember that the door had to be propped open to bring in, or the entryway into the detention center had to be propped. And that was new for just the detention center itself, to have that amount of just to having the door wide open for a long period of time to move in the equipment. But the fact that we were in the visitation space, which is typically where kids and families are meeting, and can be a safe space, but also a challenging space, especially if a kiddo has been removed from their home and they haven't seen their parents for quite some time. So the fact that we were able to go in there and transform this space into a space where kids would be telling their story or participating in using new equipment that they've never used was a really interesting thing that we were able to do, which is, I mean, we transformed a room that was normally for one thing into something completely different.
Well, and the fact that we propped open the door, that's kind of a beautiful metaphor right there when you think about it.
Yeah.
You know, that was opening the door for the Delta Project.
Yeah.
Not only to go in, but for people to exit out of that space and maybe enter into what we're trying to create, which is still an ongoing process. It's still continual iteration. I think we've been taking an approach where we're open to ideas. We don't have a set way of doing things. We observe, we listen, we pay attention to what the needs are, and we try to be present and provide resources and help people navigate.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, talking a bit about conversations, you know, those 5 episodes, that is now part of the record. That stuff is out there. And I think we're in a space where we can continue to kind of revisit. In some cases, stuff that maybe was a little traumatic, but also things that were real aha moments for both the student and the mentor, the person that joined the interview. And it's something that, you know, we hope to continue to do those conversation series, but frankly, post-COVID, things have changed. It's not, you know, it may take a different shape.
Yeah.
And it might be taking shape in this podcast.
Yeah.
Not that we aren't going to do that project again, but that project, may reform in a different way.
Yeah, I agree. I think I feel like the conversations were definitely more of an amazing anchor for us, but it's really cool. I mean, we pull up the anchor, and I mean, we now have new arms to expand how we tell the stories that we tell. And then the cool thing is that we're now inviting young people, which is what we've always done, inviting young people to the table and saying, hey, what does this need to look like? And so I think one of the other great things that we did is just having the opportunity to go back to young people and say, hey, here's an idea. And not say, here's what we're going to do, but say, here's an idea. What do you think? Let's expand it. So I think one of the things that's been really amazing for me is the idea that we really have decided to let young people allow or open the door, as you say, for young people to be able to participate in telling it, you know. So they shaped our logo. The treatment of the logo, they really helped create that. I remember them in the classroom designing logos. I think we still have that stuff somewhere. We need to archive that too. That would be a really cool book for people just to kind of see our history with just young people really developing a logo for the Delta Project. But I think the fact that they were a part of the beginning, the start, the middle, and then as we continue to grow, it's just been why I think this project is even more, important. I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it just speaks to the creative arts and the humanities, and just, it's not just video production. I mean, it's the whole process of that, but it's also graphic design and storytelling and writing and thinking. And, you know, to have an art director come into that space back in early 2019, I think it was, and work with these students and kind of go through the process that an art director goes through when they're developing creative content with these guys. Yeah. You know, how often do you get to experience that? If you're not working in that field, you've got a very limited opportunity to see how that kind of brand development works. So that's kind of cool. Yeah. That we can enlist them in that. But it's led to a variety of programs too. And I mean, I think that's the interesting thing. Yes, we have Delta Project Conversations as the anchor and kind of the establishing shot of the Delta Project story.
Yeah.
But now we have our digital edit training course. We have our Young Fathers Initiative. We have your work in the county jail and the juvenile pod.
Yeah.
And all the things that you're doing
Yeah.
on a state level, which is reaching national audiences
level,
with the work you're doing with the Governor's Council, the legislation that's recently been I don't think it's passed yet, but
it's on the floor, Senate floor.
Yeah.
So,
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think joining the task force in juvenile justice reform was, I mean, mind blowing for me because one, I'm like, hey, I'm on the ground sort of seeing this work. And they were interested enough to say, hey, we see that you guys are doing this work. How do we bring you into this space? You know, so here I am with judges across the state, prosecuting attorneys, lawyers, everyone that sort of is in the space of juvenile justice for the state of Michigan, and sitting with them to say, hey, this is what we need to do to sort of reform how we are seeing youth in our systems. But I think what was really important for me is that, you know, coming in with the lived experience of having an incarcerated son that was involved in the juvenile justice system, and then watching, unfortunately, him go through this system, go through this the child welfare system, go through the mental health system, and ultimately transition into the adult system is just really why I wanted the juvenile justice system to change. And so being able to be on that task force and talk about what parents need, what families need, you know, to talk about the court fees and fines and how that sometimes can disable parents from even being able to really support their family when they can't afford to pay for court fees and fines. So the fact that we're looking at removing that is going to be huge for families, right? You know, the idea of programming, I think that we need to find additional programming that really supports families. And I think the best way to do that is working with organizations that are grassrooted and are right there in their homes. So I think the Child Care Fund is that one of the things that we have on the Senate floor to talk about expanding so that it reaches nonprofit organizations like ours who don't necessarily have the funding to have to get researchers in to do evidence-based work, you know. So I think it's really important for us to really look at some of these things that are happening, even talking about diversion programs. We are considered in so many ways a diversion program. We want our kids to be diverted from going to a juvenile justice system or a juvenile detention center into a program. And so that really supports them. So, I mean, these things really matter. And so I'm really excited to be able to have a stake and a space in that, but also that I represent the Delta Project. But in addition to that, now we're looking at residential treatment. So, you know, to have 3 sons involved in treatment programs in the state of Michigan and sort of watching them navigate those spaces and the hardships of those, if those residential treatment programs are not up to par in really supporting kiddos, is huge. But we also have to talk about the fact that some of the work, too, is centered around parents. I mean, I think it's great that we're supporting kiddos, but if you really want to support kiddos, you have to support everybody that's connected to them. And a lot of that is parents. And so I'm honored to be doing the work and working with parents. It's probably the most challenging part of my work. But at the end of the day, I understand and recognize that they also need that support too. So I think just having that village approach has been one of the things I think is important for why we do what we do. And so that's something I've also have to share with people, that we're working with kids, but we're a part of a village, and we're helping to help kids and families see that they are a part of that village too. So that work is,
I mean,
evolving.
Yeah, we are. And one program I think we should talk about is the Young Fathers Initiative.
Yeah.
Because that's a parental program, even though we're dealing with, younger guys who are fathers and like you said, I mean, no one was asking the question. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Just teaching inside the detention center, I started wondering if there were any dads in the detention center that were coming in that were young, because a lot of my work was really around talking about fatherhood. And so, or men, just talking about men in general and role models and all of those things, right? And one of the questions that I would ask is if there's any young man in my room who has a father that's incarcerated. And sure enough, there were a lot of young men who had a father incarcerated. And so one day I just asked, well, are any of you fathers? And one said yes in one group, and one was like in another group, tell them that it's okay to tell them that you have a child. And so then I started noticing that people, they weren't being asked the questions, but they weren't also talking about it either. So there was almost a shame base that was associated with being a dad, instead of saying congratulations that you're going to be a father. So I started asking the question, and more I started finding fathers, and I was like, wait, has anybody asked you if you're a dad throughout your existence or time on probation or when you enter into the juvenile justice system? And a lot of them were like, no. And so I was like, oh, okay. And so then that made me start to ask even more questions just around paperwork and policies. Are you written in anything? Is anyone asking on an application or intake, are you a dad? And I just learned, very recently, that across the state, across the country, many kids aren't asked, particularly young men are even asked in any type of intake if they're a father. So I'm like, that's a big barrier, especially when we know that we do have kids, young dads young men who become fathers and are trying to figure out how to parent. And there's oftentimes parenting without living in the home, so they're considered non-custodial fathers. And so just trying to find ways and opportunities to connect them with services, and recognizing that it's difficult to get housing if you're a 16-year-old father, non-custodial father, and the child doesn't live with you. And so how do you take care of a child if you don't have a place? So I think there's a lot of challenges that we're facing as it relates to supporting young dads. But in addition to that, what I'm learning about young fathers is they just want to be able to have a place to be able to talk about what it even means to be a man, what it means to be a father, and to also see themselves. So to have a group of fathers, even if it's 3, they share some unique stories around fatherhood, but they also are visible because they can see themselves in each other. So I think that's been, one of our best programs thus far too, is supporting young fathers. And then in supporting them, we also find young mothers.
Yeah.
So, being able to support the whole family means that we're also supporting children. And so I think that's why this work is so important, I think, for Delta, because we're not just talking about dads, we're really talking about children. And I think that more and more, if we can get people to understand that it's about the children that we're serving, then it makes sense to support their parents.
So what does the Wi-Fi program look like on a weekly basis?
So right now we are in a school. So we connected with Southeast Career Pathways, and there were about 4 fathers in that space. And so we've had the opportunity for, I think, almost close to a year to go in and just spend time working with young dads. We use a curriculum called Son to a Father, which is an evidence-informed curriculum that was created by myself to support young fathers. So it's a 12-week course. It has a sexual health component to it. The curriculum is really centered around helping young men identify who they are, talk about toxic and masculinity and co-parenting. But most importantly, it's really centered around how do you become a healthier father. And it's written in a way that's culturally relevant, that supports Black and brown fathers. So the curriculum isn't like most curriculums that oftentimes in the fatherhood space we're using, which the curriculum has a European base to it. And so we were really intentional about even making the cover of the curriculum look like the kids that we serve. And I thought that was really cool too, to have a young father say, hey, I don't even want to write in this curriculum or write in the book because I don't want to damage this, because it's reflective of me. And so, I think that's what sparked me wanting to write a comic book series about Black and brown fathers, wanting to create material for Black and brown fathers. And I realized simply because the material isn't written. And so how do you become visible? Again, it goes back to our North Star. How do I become something I don't see? So I think for us, it's really expanding Son to a Father. The curriculum itself, we're currently having it in 4 other sites in the state of Michigan. But the hope right now is to create young fathers who could actually facilitate these, the Young Father Initiative, not just in one school, alternative school, but possibly in many more. We know here in Grand Rapids there are a host of young dads, but we may not know where they are. And so the hope this year is to recruit and train a bunch of young fathers to actually, facilitate and coach other dads. And so I think that's the dream, that's the vision. And so I think we're excited to see that happen. Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about our new initiative too, our girls program? Because I'm really excited about, we've always talked about working with boys. And so I think the idea of serving girls just makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's really tied to Next Tech High School, which is also a really strong partner
Yeah.
of ours, and a school that we've had a real affinity for and have begun to work with more closely. But, when we had Renee Cummings visiting from University of Virginia, where she's, data activist in residence and is focused on racial bias and data, and now with generative AI and everything that's happening, her credentials and her movement in that space is really important because of her background and what she's been able to share. But when she spoke at Next Tech High School, I thought it was really cool that we had those 5 girls come up to her after her presentation and really open up to her about their struggles. And that was kind of the moment. Another moment, it wasn't necessarily a question that was asked, but it was another one of those moments that creates momentum. And Renee saw it. We saw it. What happened? I mean, one of the girls felt like she had run away from home and she was kind of in the juvenile justice system because of that. And she was convinced she couldn't go to college.
Yeah.
And that just...
she thought she had a record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if no one had really helped her understand that that wasn't the case, she would be operating under an illusion, following something that wasn't true and having that guide her life when talk about, not being able to become something you don't see. It's kind of the opposite of that question. So the opportunity to enlighten her and help her see that she's got potential. Kind of led us down this path where, a number of months later, we've kind of piloted a program at Next Tech with these 5 young women. We've been involved with Renee Cummings. Renee came back to visit and spend time with the girls. And we're looking to really get things going this fall at Next Tech High School. Bringing on a new partner, Miss Shonda, hopefully to work with the girls and really get that program going as well.
Yeah. So shout out to Miss Shonda, Shonda Vaughn, who does amazing work in this community, has done amazing work serving kiddos in this community for many, 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 many years. And so I met Shonda in the Juvenile Detention Center as well as a teacher on Fridays. And so I've always been impressed by the way that she interacts with kiddos, but how she also inspires them and how she shows up for them. I mean, moving her schedule, and she's always present. And so I think that she's a present pillar, and it just makes sense for someone like her to be a part of our team. And so I'm excited that she's, eager. She would probably be like, why are you guys talking about me on this podcast? But I would even love to have her in this space at some point because her lived experience and the stories and, her contribution to the community and the kids and families is, why this work is so deeply and needed and important. So I'm glad to have Shonda on board. And what about future skills?
Well, I was going to mention that next. That's been kind of our baby, taking this idea of production a step further to post-production. And right now, future skills consists of digital edit training, teaching guys how to work in Adobe Premiere Pro so that they can create a YouTube channel, a music video. They can kind of let their creative juices flow and have, potentially learn the skills to create their own media. Because, it's great to learn on that program because that is the industry standard. But learning the nuts and bolts of editing, you don't have to edit on Adobe Premiere. It does cost money. We have a number of licenses that we use, but ultimately the whole Adobe Creative Suite can be available to guys and gals that take part in our programs. So those future skills, I think it's a great name for what we're doing because it's not just about digital editing. It's going to be about so much more in the technical arts and the creative arts that allow kids to gain these skills that can make them money, can give them a career, that can help them, again, become something they don't see.
Yeah. And I think what's also great about what we're doing is that we're also giving these tools and skills to Black and brown kiddos who now will have the opportunity to use these tools to go back into their homes and go back into their community and capture and tell the story that they are actually living and seeing. And so I think it's really cool that instead of focusing on one narrative, we give kids the tools to be able to focus on a variety of narratives that belong to them. And I think that's, for me, has been really, really the most important key to this piece, is that, so often than not, the narrative is told one way. And like we just said, the young lady who heard this story bought this narrative and just sort of said, oh my gosh, this is going to be this false truth about whether or not I can go to college. So having the information, having the skills, having the tools in your own hands allows you to be able to run it in a way that sees fit. And we know the power of narratives when a person has the tools. I mean, it can destroy or it can build. And so I think that, us help giving young people these tools will allow them to have the opportunity to build. And I mean, I think that's the root of why we're doing this work.
I mean, you don't want data or stories or news or media to force people to have to relive traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
And so much of how we approach data in our society forces many people to revisit their trauma and become traumatized again. And we wonder why they might struggle to reach what we might call success. Well, what is success for one thing? But when you're dealing with certain things that you've got to overcome to get there, and you're really starting from ground zero, it's challenging. There's not enough housing. There's so many complicating factors and systems that need to be disrupted a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, we need to revisit the status quo a little bit more and really ask ourselves, are the things that we take for granted things that we should be taking for granted?
Yeah.
Are we biased? Are we using heuristics to get to an outcome that we shouldn't really be getting to? We have to think more deeply about where we're headed and how we can change course.
Yeah. Well, I love the word you use, disrupt. And some people will hear disrupt and it sounds terrorizing, but I mean, I think disruption is key to a lot of this. And I just had someone say something as I was saying something about, our systems are broken. And then in reflecting on that, they're like, no, our systems aren't broken. Our systems are designed the way that they were supposed to be designed. Mm-hmm. And I think when reflecting on that, I'm like, oh yeah, that's why the fight is so strong. It was designed this way. And so I think when we talk about the kids that we're serving, the parents that we're serving, we have to recognize that if they're in a system, as you like to describe, that is broken, they're not going to be transformed in that system. It really takes the people that work in that system to be intentional about how they provide resources and how they support families in the way that makes sense to families, so that they can really grow in and out of the system, right? But it took me a while. I'm like, oh, these are broken systems. And I'm like, no, they're designed that way. And so how do we disrupt that? And I think that the Delta Project is we're doing that, We're doing that.
Little bit at a time, little bit each day.
Yeah.
I think that's another lesson we've learned is this doesn't happen quickly.
No.
It takes time. It takes commitment. But I think we've been lucky to make some progress.
Yeah.
I don't take that for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have some amazing people on our board. I think we've just been surrounded by people who absolutely believe in the work and are willing to, bootstrap it with us. So,
yeah. I mean, it's a startup.
Yeah.
It's, I've said, it's designated as a nonprofit, but you still have to treat it as a business startup.
Yeah.
Just because it's a nonprofit doesn't mean, you're in a situation where you're not hustling and working hard to make something become.
Yeah.
It's a passion.
Yeah.
I think this podcast is going to be part of that passion. And this podcast is going to, this is really kind of our prototype, our first kind of discussion about where we're going to head with this podcast that is entitled What I Know Now as the working thesis. But this is going to evolve as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to lead us, take us further on our journey, and hopefully help us interact with more people so that we can tell their stories and they can break bread with us at Early Bird or wherever.
Yeah.
Be in the studio. There are 4 mics here.
Yeah.
Cole and I each have a mic, but ultimately there's room at this table for other voices. And it's our intention to fill this table on a regular basis.
Man, I love that. Wow. Sounds good, Joel.
Okay. Maybe that's a wrap, huh?
Yeah, you wrapped that up quite well.